These are true stories, shared by people who went into the woods and came back changed. I went camping once with a few people I had recently become friends with, and one of them immediately made a strange request. He insisted that he could not share a tent with anyone because he sleepwalked. We had already planned everything out, with him sharing a tent with another friend while my girlfriend and I had our own. I was honestly annoyed because it meant my girlfriend and I had to squeeze into a tent that wasn't really meant for two people, but I decided it wasn't worth ruining the weekend over. Looking back, that decision probably saved us from being even closer to what happened later. Sometime during the night, my girlfriend woke me up and quietly told me that our friend was freaking her out. I looked outside the tent and saw him wandering around the campsite in circles. He appeared completely out of it. Since we'd already been warned that he sleepwalked, I figured this was just one of those episodes. I told her we should keep an eye on him and make sure he didn't wander into the woods or hurt himself. At that point I was concerned, but I still wasn't expecting anything truly dangerous. About 30 seconds later, he suddenly started screaming, "Hello," at the top of his lungs. He kept doing it while standing in the middle of the campsite, and within seconds everyone was awake. We were all staring at him, trying to figure out what the hell he was doing. Then he turned toward the woods and yelled, "Hello" again, and raised a pistol toward the darkness. Thankfully, he wasn't pointing it toward any of us, but seeing someone apparently sleepwalking while holding a gun changes the entire atmosphere instantly. What had started as a weird camping story suddenly felt like a situation where somebody could get seriously hurt. Until that moment, I had no idea he had even brought a gun. I immediately grabbed mine because my first thought was that this guy might accidentally shoot somebody while he was wandering around half-conscious. Fortunately, that didn't happen. Instead, he calmly put his pistol down, walked back into his tent, climbed inside, and went straight back to sleep as if absolutely nothing had happened. Meanwhile, the rest of us were left sitting there wondering whether we had just witnessed the strangest 5 minutes of our lives. The next morning, I asked him what the hell he had been doing. That's when things somehow became even stranger. He told me he actually hadn't been asleep at all. According to him, he thought he had heard coyotes somewhere nearby, and instead of waking everyone else up or staying with the group, his first instinct was to walk outside alone in the middle of the night and investigate. I couldn't understand that decision then, and I definitely couldn't understand it after watching him point a gun into the woods. Needless to say, I never went camping with him again. A few years later, I found out that this wasn't even the strangest thing he'd ever done. He apparently made the news after terrifying an entire campsite by running through the woods and firing his gun randomly because he claimed he had seen Bigfoot and was trying to track it down. At that point, the whole thing finally made sense in the worst possible way. Some people are just unpredictable. But an unpredictable person carrying a gun in the middle of the wilderness is a completely different level of dangerous. Looking back, I don't remember being afraid of the woods that night nearly as much as I was afraid of the person standing in our campsite. 2 years ago, my wife and I went camping, and during the trip we met two brothers who had set up their tent not far from ours. That evening, they invited us over to their campsite for hot dogs, and since I had brought my guitar, they asked me to play some music. At first, everything seemed completely normal. We were sitting around their campsite, talking and joking, and I didn't have any reason to think the evening was going to turn into something I'd remember for years. At one point, I was sitting by myself on a short log playing my guitar when I overheard one of the brothers invite my wife to sit between them on a larger log. I didn't think much of it at first, but I started noticing how comfortable they seemed around her. Later, when my wife and I returned to our own campsite, I told her I thought the two men had been unusually friendly with her. I also mentioned that I thought I'd seen one of them touch her in a way that seemed inappropriate. What surprised me was that she didn't seem particularly bothered by it. She said she had noticed but didn't think much of it. That conversation left me with a strange feeling I couldn't quite shake. Instead of arguing about it, I started wondering whether there was something about the situation she wasn't telling me. I asked her directly how she felt about the attention they were giving her, and she didn't really answer. That puzzled me more than an argument probably would have. I realized there was a side of the situation she had been keeping to herself, and suddenly those seemingly harmless interactions from earlier that night didn't feel harmless anymore. The following day, we ran into the brothers again near a small creek and beach area not far from our campsite. My wife sat down on the towel we had spread across the sand while the two men were nearby. I noticed they kept finding reasons to talk to her, and she seemed perfectly comfortable talking back. Every time I looked over, one of them seemed to be getting closer to her. At that point, I started wondering whether I was imagining things or whether there was genuinely something going on between them. Eventually, I decided to go swimming. Every so often, I'd look back toward the beach and see my wife talking with the two brothers. When I returned, the men were gone, and my wife asked me how much longer I wanted to stay. I told her maybe another hour. She immediately said that was too long and that she was going back to our campsite. Something about the way she said it made me suspicious. The campsite wasn't directly visible from the beach, so I followed behind her for a short distance. I stopped once I could see our tent and watched her continue walking. Instead of going into our tent, she walked straight toward the brothers' tent. I stood there completely stunned. I watched her disappear inside, and for several minutes I just stood there trying to process what I had seen. Eventually, I went back to our tent and waited. I didn't confront her immediately because I wanted to hear what she would say when she returned. I ended up falling asleep while waiting, and about an hour later I woke up when she opened the tent flap. I told her I had seen exactly where she'd gone. She didn't try to deny it. Instead, she quietly admitted that she'd gone into their tent. The conversation that followed was uncomfortable, but strangely enough, it also became the moment when we stopped pretending there hadn't been something unusual happening between the three of them. What happened afterward changed our relationship in a way neither of us expected. Rather than ending our marriage, the incident forced us to have conversations about trust, boundaries, jealousy, and things we had apparently been afraid to discuss with each other. Looking back, the camping trip wasn't really about those two brothers. They simply exposed problems and desires that had already existed beneath the surface of our marriage. 9 months later, my wife gave birth to a baby. I already knew the child wasn't biologically mine because I was sterile, so there was never any question about that. Surprisingly, the situation didn't destroy our family. Instead, it became part of the complicated story of how our family eventually began. What started as an ordinary camping trip ended up forcing us to confront parts of our relationship that we'd never been willing to talk about before. Many years ago, I went camping with 4 friends and family members on some state game lands in the northeastern United States. And what happened that night was enough to permanently ruin one of my favorite camping spots. It was October, so the temperatures were already starting to drop, especially once the sun went down. We had been to this area before. There was a large creek running through the forest, along with smaller streams, waterfalls, and plenty of trails that made the area great for hiking. This time, though, we decided not to hike very far. Instead, we drove deep into the woods along dirt roads until we reached a bridge that looked like it might collapse if we actually tried driving across it. We parked just before the bridge and continued on foot. By then, the sun was already going down, which was another reason we didn't want to wander too far. We crossed the creek using the bridge and followed a trail until we found a place that looked perfect for camping. Our campsite was tucked away from the trail, but we could still see our vehicle on the opposite side of the creek. We set up the tents, got a fire going, and even found a small depression in the creek where we could keep our beers cold. Everything about the location seemed ideal. The first part of the night was honestly one of the best camping experiences I can remember. We were laughing, playing music from my brother's hand-crank radio, drinking, dancing around the fire, and generally acting stupid in the way people do when they're having a good time in the middle of nowhere. Then, sometime around 1 in the morning, everything changed. We suddenly noticed a light moving through the woods. At first, it looked like a vehicle approaching us. Thankfully, everyone in our group reacted almost immediately. We put out the fire as quickly and quietly as possible, grabbed the weapons and tools we had with us, and hid. We had no idea who was coming or why they were driving around the woods in the middle of the night. As the lights got closer, we realized there were actually 2 vehicles. They were trucks, and there appeared to be a lot of people with them. We could hear them yelling, laughing, and shouting as they approached. Eventually, they reached the area where our vehicle was parked and suddenly stopped. The people got out and continued yelling. We could barely see them through the darkness, but we could hear the truck doors closing. Then, someone switched on a massive spotlight. The beam swept through the forest, mostly toward the area where our campfire had been. They were clearly searching for us. The shouting continued, and then someone started using a bullhorn. They were yelling for us to come out, saying they knew we were hiding and that they were going to find us. From the shadows and the movement around the trucks, we estimated there were around 12 people, with several apparently riding in the backs of the vehicles. Eventually, they found our campsite, but fortunately they didn't find us. Seeing an empty campsite seemed to make them angry. Their yelling became louder, and the person with the bullhorn kept shouting, although after a while we couldn't even understand what he was saying. Then we heard glass breaking. It sounded like bottles being smashed around the campsite. A few moments later, someone fired a gun into the air. Then more gunshots followed. There were so many that I lost track of how many times they fired. Some of the weapons sounded extremely powerful, and although I'm not an expert, I remember seeing one that looked similar to my friend's rifle. The worst part was that none of us knew what these people actually wanted. We were hiding in complete darkness while a group of armed strangers were partying around our abandoned campsite. They continued yelling, drinking, and firing into the air for what felt like an entire hour. Eventually, their behavior became more like a drunken party. At one point, they started blasting incredibly loud country music, which somehow seemed to calm everyone down. It was such a bizarre contrast to what had been happening that I almost couldn't believe it. We were lying silently in the woods while a group of armed strangers were partying next to our tents. Eventually, they packed everything up and drove away. Before leaving, the person with the bullhorn shouted something along the lines of, "We'll be back, we're gonna get you." They never came back. They also never crossed the bridge toward where we had been hiding, which still bothers me because I have no idea whether that was intentional or simply luck. None of us really slept afterward. We tried taking turns keeping watch, but nobody could relax enough to actually feel safe. We stopped drinking completely because the situation had sobered everyone up instantly. The strangest part is that the place had been one of my favorite camping and hiking locations before that night. Afterward, I couldn't bring myself to go back. Sometimes it only takes one unexplained encounter to completely change the way you see a place, and for me, that campsite was never peaceful again. Story 5. For several years in my early 20s, I worked as a counselor at a summer camp. It wasn't the kind of camp you usually see in movies. It was held on a college campus, and the campers stayed in dormitories while attending classes and activities inside the college buildings during the day. There was only one session each summer, lasting several weeks, and many of the kids returned every year. Because they spent so much time together, strong friendships developed between the campers, and the counselors became familiar faces they trusted. The campers ranged from older elementary school students to teenagers in their early high school years. Because some of the older campers were getting closer in age to the counselors, our training emphasized boundaries. We were repeatedly told what kind of contact was appropriate, what crossed the line, and how serious the consequences could be if a counselor abused their position. At the time, I understood those rules perfectly. I knew why they existed, and for the first couple of years, I never had a problem following them. It wasn't unusual for some of the older campers to develop crushes on counselors. That happened from time to time, and I experienced it myself. Usually, it was easy to redirect the attention without making the situation uncomfortable. But during my final summer at the camp, two teenage girls who shared a dorm room began paying me unusually close attention. They were both around 14, and over time, their behavior became increasingly inappropriate. I knew immediately that I should have created more distance. Instead, I made the first serious mistake by allowing their attention to flatter me. I told myself that I wasn't doing anything wrong because I hadn't technically crossed a line yet. That's the kind of thinking that makes dangerous situations worse. Instead of recognizing the warning signs and protecting the campers, I allowed myself to become comfortable with the attention. Eventually, my judgment completely failed me. One night after lights out, I allowed the situation to progress into serious misconduct involving both girls. I knew I was violating the rules I'd been trained to follow, and I knew they were children who were supposed to be under my supervision and protection. There was no excuse for what happened, and the fact that I had been warned repeatedly about these boundaries makes my actions even harder to justify. Afterward, everyone involved agreed not to talk about what had happened. The camp continued for another couple of weeks, and I tried to convince myself that I could simply move forward as though nothing had happened. Nothing else inappropriate happened after that night, but I couldn't completely escape what I'd done. During the final week of camp, the two girls had a serious argument. The fight became bad enough that one of them eventually left camp early. I never found out exactly what caused the argument, and that's something that has stayed with me. Part of me has always wondered whether what happened with me played a role in their conflict. I have no way of knowing for certain, but the uncertainty has never made me feel better. Years have passed since then. I haven't had any meaningful contact with either of them, although both eventually added me as a friend on Facebook independently. I don't know whether they still communicate with each other, and I have no idea whether either of them remembers what happened the way I do. What I do know is that I've gone through periods where the guilt becomes difficult to ignore. At other times, I manage to push it into the back of my mind and continue living normally. But every once in a while, something reminds me of that summer, and I remember that I was given responsibility over young people who trusted me, and I betrayed that responsibility. There is also the fear of consequences. I know that what I did could have serious legal and personal consequences if it ever became known. Even years later, that possibility remains in the back of my mind. I don't know whether either of the women will ever speak about it, and I have no reason to believe that they will. But that's the problem with doing something you know is wrong. Even when nothing happens afterward, you still have to live with the knowledge that it happened. Looking back now, the part that bothers me most isn't whether I will eventually face consequences. It's knowing that I was an adult who was supposed to protect children, and I failed at the most basic responsibility of that position. No amount of time can turn that into something acceptable. The camp ended years ago, but the memory of what I did never really did.